All right. So last week, I was asked to speak about the latter days and what that means, because we ran into that expression in Isaiah, and a question came up about it. So I want us to look at a number of verses that talk about the latter days or the last days, and have an idea from how it's used as to what that expression means. And as we mentioned last time in the answering the question, it's all about the context as to how we can understand the specifics about it. But I want to start off with this passage in Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 20. It says, "Listen to counsel and receive instruction, that you may be wise in your latter days." I think we understand what that means in this context, especially because it says your latter days. It's talking to an individual, a person, not a nation. It just means when you're old, or sometime in the future, right? Sometime probably not tomorrow in the future, but later on, right? The later days. And so we get that idea that this expression is talking about sometime in the more distant future, the latter days. And we have a number of ways it's used specifically, or what it refers to specifically throughout the scriptures. One of those ways is the captivity and return of Judah from from Babylon. And in Deuteronomy chapter 4, now this is a general curse and promises about their future that God is making through Moses. But Deuteronomy 4 and verse 30 says, "When you are in distress and all these things come upon you in the latter days, when you turn to the Lord your God and obey his voice, for the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not forsake you nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant of your fathers, which he swore to them." So here we see this distress that's going to come upon them in the latter days, but God is not going to destroy them. This is the idea of the captivity and the return from captivity, which would be far in the future for Israel, but it's not even what we might consider the last days of Israel. But it is the beginning of the last 400 years of them as a nation. But it's not really something that we would think of as like the end of their time. It's just referring to something far in the future. In chapter 31 of Deuteronomy, verse 29, it says, "For I know that after my death you will become utterly corrupt and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days, because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands." And this could refer to many different times throughout the history of Israel. It could refer to the times of the judges, during the times of some of the kings, the captivity, even the destruction of Jerusalem in the time of the kingdom of Christ. But he's just saying, I know later on in the latter days, sometime in the future, you're going to turn away from God, and these bad things are going to happen to you. In Ezekiel 38 in verse 16, he says, "You will come up against my people." So this is a prophecy about these nations, Gog and Magog. And anyway, he says, "You will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. It will be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me when I am hallowed in you, O Gog, before their eyes." Now, I'm not someone who knows everything about these prophecies, and this was during the captivity when this prophecy was made, and it's now referring to something in the latter days that's going to happen. It seems like this is the idea of what's going to happen during the return, that the nations would be against Israel. You find the Greek empires, that's broken up into four parts. Especially two of those parts keep fighting over the land of Israel, and eventually Israel is able to gain its independence and so on. God protects them throughout that time. They're not destroyed. But this very similar prophecy is used to refer to something that the book of Revelation speaks about. So that's even farther in the future. This idea of the latter days just means somewhere in the future. And sometimes we can't nail it down as easily as to what the timing is. We can't just take the expression the latter days and say it refers to this particular time because that expression is used. It just means sometime in the future. And so we have to use the context, and if the context doesn't give us enough to know exactly what it's talking about, then we just know it's sometime in the future from when that was written, and that's all we know. But a lot of times this expression does talk about the coming of the Messiah and the establishment of his kingdom. So that's what we ran into in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, where it says, "Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it." Now, we don't know that this is talking about the time of the Messiah because of the expression the latter days. We know that this expression the latter days is talking about the time of the Messiah because of what it's talking about. So when he talks about the mountain of the Lord's house being established on top of the mountains and being exalted above the hills and all nations flowing to it, it's the idea of his holy place, his holy people, Jerusalem, Zion, where the temple of God is, where he dwells among men, is going to be for all people. All nations shall flow to it. You get a little bit of that fulfillment in the return from captivity when they rebuild the temple, and you do have people from other nations joining themselves to the Jews. You read about that in the book of Esther and some other places, but that's not really what he's dealing with here. Ultimately, this is going to be fulfilled in the church, which is referred to as Zion in the New Testament. This is the mountain of the Lord, and that is sometime in the future. That's when the Messiah comes. He establishes his kingdom, and all nations flow to it. People from everywhere can be part of this great kingdom which the Messiah rules over and be part of the Lord's house. In Numbers chapter 24, I think I got this a little out of order. I just wanted to note that in Micah chapter 4 and verse 1, it's almost word for word the same as in Isaiah 2 verse 2. It says, "Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and peoples shall flow to it." So it's almost word for word the same as the prophecy in Isaiah. But here in Numbers 24, in verse 14, this is Balaam talking to Balak, the king of Moab. Moab was afraid of Israel as they were coming into the land, and they had hired Balaam to curse Israel, but instead he was blessing Israel. And so now he says in verse 14, "And now indeed I am going to..." No, I'm sorry. I've got... Yeah, no, that's right. I apologize. something threw me off there. But he says, now indeed I am going to my people. Come, I will advise you what this people will do to your people in the latter days. So before Balaam went back to where he lived, he says, this is what Israel's going to do to Moab in the latter days. And then when you get down to verse 17 of this prophecy of what would happen in the latter days, he says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel and batter the brow of Moab and destroy all the sons of tumult. Now, this could be a prophecy of some of the kings of Israel defeating Moab. But it seems like in a number of the prophets, Moab is part of the group that's used to represent the enemies of God's people that will be destroyed and overcome by the Christ. And so we find that this fits Christ, the Messiah, the best, this prophecy. And so he's talking about what will happen in the latter days, and that's the time of the rule of the Messiah. And so, that's sometime later. We don't know how long. As he says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. It's something in the future, in the latter days. Okay, I got this in here twice, I guess. But in Daniel chapter 2, verse 28, Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. And this was where Nebuchadnezzar had seen the statue where he had the head of gold, which represented Babylon, and then the different metals that represent these kingdoms up through Rome, and then the rock that came and crushed them and grew into a great mountain. And that was the kingdom of God, the kingdom of the Christ, the Messiah. And so what will happen in the latter days? Well, part of it was at that time, right? The head of gold was, he said, that's you, Nebuchadnezzar. So that part was already present. Okay. I don't know if I'm still online or not. Can somebody tell me? Our power just went out. Can you hear me? I don't think I am. Oh, boy. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. All right, sorry about that. I don't know why our power went out, but anyway. All right, so so he's just talking about in the future, and eventually that would be the time of the Christ and his kingdom. All right. In Hosea chapter 3, verse 5, it says, afterward the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. And as this refers to David, and this is after the time of David, long after, it's a reference to the Christ. And so the latter days here again refers to the time of the Messiah and his kingdom. There's even some that refers to the 400 years of silence. In Daniel chapter 10, verse 14, Daniel is told, now I have come to make you understand what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision refers to many days yet to come. And he talks about the wars between the Syrian Greeks and the Egyptian Greeks during those 400 years of silence. And so that is the latter days in this context. It's in the future. And then it can just be later in their own lives. So in Jeremiah 23 and verses 16 through 21, we won't read the whole thing, but God tells the people, stop listening to the prophets who are not prophesying truly from the Lord. They're saying that you'll have peace, but they're not going to have peace. And in verse 20, he says, the anger of the Lord will not turn back until he has executed and performed the thoughts of his heart. In the latter days, you will understand it perfectly. And so he says that the latter days here is part of their own time, where they are they're going to understand that these prophets were false prophets. In Jeremiah 30, in verse 24, again, he says, the fierce anger of the Lord will not return until he has done it, and until he has performed the intents of his heart. In the latter days, you will consider it. So the latter days he's referring to here are the latter days of these people he's talking to. You will consider it in the latter days. All right, and then there's the term the last days. In Genesis 49, Jacob, when he prophesies to his sons, gives them their blessings. He called his sons and said, gather together that I may tell you what may befall you in the last days. That doesn't mean the end of the world. He's actually talking about what will happen with their tribes. So Simeon and Levi are brothers. In verse 7, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. That's not the end of the world. That's what happens when they enter the land. In verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. So that's about the rule of the kings from Judah, David's family, until Christ essentially comes and the people obey him. In verse 13, Zebulun shall dwell by the haven of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall adjoin Sidon. That doesn't sound like it's talking about the end of the world when it talks about the last days, right? And same thing for the other sons. In Acts chapter 2, in verse 17, we mentioned this when we looked at the book of Joel. But it says, and it shall come to pass in the last days, says God, that I will pour out of my spirit on all flesh. In Joel 2, verse 28, that he's quoting from, it says, it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. So Peter changes the wording a little bit from afterward to in the last days, but he's not talking about the end of the world. He's talking about something that would happen later on, and Peter's saying it's now that time. This is the time that he was talking about that would happen in the future. In 2 Timothy 3, verse 1, Paul tells Timothy, but know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. Is this the end of the world? Well, what does he say will happen? Men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, and so on. And when you get down to verse 5, having a form of godliness, but denying its power, and from such people turn away. He's telling Timothy that's happening now. In the last days, we're in it. They were already in it at that time. And so he's saying that's already the case. This is not something new. But in the last days, it's going to be like this. And so turn away from such people. That was a warning to Timothy in that time. In Hebrews 1, verse 2, God who at various, in verse 1, says, God who at various times and in various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. So he says here, we're in the last days, these last days. This is later on. This is what was prophesied about. This is the future. We're already in the future. James 5, verse 3, your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. You're already in the last days. And yes, some of this, the terminology may refer to the last days of Jerusalem. It may refer to the last days of the Judaism and that way of life. But it's in general, it just means this is the time now that was prophesied about. And again, in 2 Peter 3:3, we won't read all of this, but he talks about the words that were spoken before, that these things would happen. Scoffers would come in the last days. And it seems like he's saying, remember that was said before, and that it would come in the last days. Well, we're in the last days now. And so don't be surprised that people are talking like this. So in the latter days, or in the last days, mean about the same thing. They mean sometime in the future. In the last days may be a little bit more specific about the time of the Messiah, but we saw from the usage in Genesis and the prophecy about Jacob's sons and Israel that it's not specific to a particular time of the future. Necessarily. Again, it's based on context that we can understand it. So the most common way the expressions are used refers to the coming of the Messiah and his kingdom being established, but other ways that they're used to talk about is sometime later in a person's lifetime, or the captivity, the return, or the 400 years of silence. The meaning always depends on the context. So we just have to look and see, okay, it's talking about the future. Can we understand what part of the future it's talking about? All right, well, that's the lesson. I hope that's helpful in understanding these things. Thank you.